The heavy, iron-bound stones of Dreadhollow Keep groaned as the eastern gate finally buckled, shrieking like a dying beast. Inside the courtyard, the air was a toxic soup of freezing mist and stinging ash. Chaos reigned, but it was a cowardly chaos. Men who had sworn blood oaths to the crown, mighty alphas and seasoned warriors, were not fighting. They were sprinting. Their boots thundered against the frost-slicked cobblestones as they fled toward the dark safety of the tree line, abandoning their posts and their honor. Noble wolves, shifted and sleek, vanished into the shadows like smoke, leaving the scent of terror in their wake. The Dreadhollow Invincibles had become nothing more than a panicked herd, their silver-trimmed capes snagging on the very rubble they were meant to defend. In the dead center of that abandoned, burning world, the space seemed to freeze. A girl in a threadbare gray servant's dress, her hem stained with the soot of the kitchens and the blood of the siege, dropped to her knees on the frozen ground. She had no sword,
no armor, no rank.
She was the ghost of the halls, the Omega they had stepped over for years without a second glance. To the retreating guards, she was part of the masonry. To the invaders, she was a footnote. With a low, gut-wrenching sob, she pulled the two royal cubs, Fergus and Oisín, beneath her. She tucked their trembling faces deep into the crook of her neck, shielding their eyes from the slaughter. The boys' small fingers clawed at her rough bodice, their whimpers muffled by her heartbeat. Then, Brynn Morrigan spread her arms wide, her body forming a fragile, human shield over the heirs of the north. She stood as a solitary monument of defiance against a landscape of desertion. Above, on the stone battlements, 40 crossbows clicked into place. The traitors didn't hesitate. The moonlight glinted off the cold steel of the bolts, aimed at the only heart left in the kingdom that hadn't turned to ice.
Thwack!
The iron-tipped bolts fell like a black rain, biting into the stone and tearing through wool and skin alike. Brynn didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She simply tightened her hold on the boys, her teeth bared in a silent snarl of protective agony, bracing her spine against the inevitable dark. She would be the wall they could not breach. The screen fades to a searing, blood-stained white. If you enjoyed this look into the dark world of Dreadhollow, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Don't miss out on more relevant video uploads as we uncover the mystery of the Morrigan bloodline. The damp chill of the Dreadhollow stones always bit deepest before the sun dared to touch the Highland peaks. For Brynn Morrigan, the day did not begin with the majestic call of a horn or the soft stirrings of a silk-draped bed. It began with the weight of 2 iron buckets and the grueling ascent of the servants' spiral. The castle was a beast of granite and ego, and Brynn was merely the blood that moved quietly through its veins to keep it functioning. She climbed 4 flights of stairs until her lungs burned and her scarred palms throbbed, delivering heated water to rooms where nobles would soon wake to complain about the temperature of the air. In the great hall, Brynn was less than the tapestries that lined the walls. She ate her breakfast standing in the kitchen's threshold, a heel of stale bread and a cup of watered-down cider, while the high-ranking alphas of the King's Guard boomed their laughter just a few feet away. They looked through her as if she were made of glass. To them, she was a nameless Omega, a creature of submission whose only purpose was to scrub the evidence of their excess from the floorboards. She had learned to keep her chin tucked, her eyes fixed on the dust, and her presence so small that she became a part of the shadows she inhabited. But as she pushed open the heavy oak doors of the royal nursery, the world changed. The suffocating weight of the castle's hierarchy evaporated in the warmth of the hearth fire. "Brynny!" The cry came from Fergus, the eldest of the king's sons. At 7, he was already a miniature of his father, possessed of a fierce, restless pride and a chin that was perpetually bruised from some new adventure. He charged at her, nearly toppling the fresh linens in her arms, his eyes bright with a recognition the rest of the world denied her. Behind him, perched on a low stool by the window, was little Oisín. The younger twin was a creature of silence and soft edges, his mother's gentle eyes mirrored in a face that seemed too fragile for a warlord's citadel. Oisín didn't shout. He simply held out his palm to show her his morning's work. There, Carved from a scrap of tallow soap was a tiny, lopsided bird. It was delicate and beautiful, a small testament to a soul that hadn't yet been hardened by the expectations of the pack. Brynn set her bundles down and knelt, taking the soap carving with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. "It's perfect, Oisín," she whispered, her voice raspy from a morning of silence. In this room, she wasn't a servant or a ghost. She was the one who mended their tunics after a scuffle, the one who pressed cool cloths to their foreheads when the night fevers came, and the only one who listened to the whispered fears they dared not tell their distant father. King Cormac provided the walls, but Brynn provided the heart. She smoothed Fergus's wild dark hair and pulled Oisín into the crook of her arm, feeling the steady thrum of their lives against her own. She bore no title, and no silver circlet rested upon her brow, but as she watched them play in the safety of the firelight, the truth was written in the way they reached for her hand. She was the shield they didn't know they needed, a queen in every way that required a sacrifice of the soul. The weight of the peat bricks in Brynn's basket was a dull ache against her hip, but it was a familiar burden, one that allowed her to move through the upper corridors like a shifting pocket of fog. The castle was held in the breathless grip of the second watch, the air thick with the smell of guttering tallow and the distant, lonely howl of a wind trapped in the battlements. She reached the landing of the war room, her breath catching as she noticed the door wasn't just ajar. It was slumped open, spilling a sliver of jagged amber light onto the cold floor. She should have kept walking. She should have been the invisible girl the world required her to be. But the silence in the hall was too heavy, and the voices within were too low. "The northern passage will be cleared by the second bell." Commander Callum's voice drifted through the gap, devoid of its usual performative gallantry. It sounded like the rasp of a whetstone on steel. "Cale's wolves enter through the eastern breach. We ensure the distraction at the armory is loud enough to drown out the nursery." "And the children?" Lady Morag's response was a silken thread of ice. "There can be no loose threads for Cormac to pull when he returns. A king without an heir is merely a man with a crown he cannot keep." "Make it clean," Callum replied, the finality of the words hitting Brynn like a physical blow to the solar plexus. "The heirs are not to reach morning. By the time the king sees the smoke from the border, he will be coming home to a graveyard." The world tilted. Brynn's blood turned to slush in her veins. She took a staggering step back, her mind a frantic blur of Fergus's boisterous laugh and Oisín's soap carvings. In her haste to vanish, her foot found the one thing she knew better than her own name. The loose flagstone she had scrubbed every morning for 3 years, the one with the uneven edge she had never reported for fear of drawing attention to herself. The crack of the stone against the subfloor echoed through the silent corridor like a thunderclap. The voices inside the war room died instantly. The sudden, predatory vacuum of sound was more terrifying than the words she had just heard. A chair scraped harshly against the floor. Heavy, purposeful footsteps began to move toward the door. Brynn didn't wait to be found. She didn't stay to plead. She turned and sprinted, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs that drowned out the sound of her own gasping breath. She didn't run to the barracks. The guards were Callum's men now. She didn't run to the Great Hall. It was a theater for traitors. She ran up. She ran toward the only truth she had ever known, her feet finding the servants' stairs in a desperate, lung-searing climb. Every shadow seemed to reach for her, every flickering torch a witness to her flight. The shadow game was no longer a lesson for the boys. It was a race against a clock that was already striking midnight. She burst into the nursery, her lungs burning, her eyes wide with a terror she could no longer hide. The boys were asleep, their breathing rhythmic and innocent, unaware that the stones beneath them were already rotting. Brynn fell to her knees beside their bed, her hands trembling as she reached for them. The morning was coming, and she was the only wall standing between them and the dark. The second bell did not toll. It was swallowed by an explosion that rocked the very foundations of the keep. The eastern gate, a mass of ancient oak and reinforced iron, didn't just give way. It shrieked as it was torn from its hinges, the sound of splintering would echoing through the citadel like the death rattle of a giant. Brynn had no time to catch her breath. From the window, the horizon was no longer black. It was a bruised, angry orange. Fire was blooming in the east wing, licking hungrily at the armory, and the distant, rhythmic howl of Cale's mercenary wolves began to rise over the screams of the dying. Brynn lunged for the nursery door, her only thought to spirit the boys into the labyrinth of the walls before the slaughter reached the landing. But when she gripped the heavy iron handle, it didn't budge. She threw her shoulder against the wood, the impact jarring her bones, but the door was dead weight. Through the small viewing grate, she saw the silhouette of a heavy iron bar slotted firmly into the exterior brackets. Lady Morag had not just left them to die. She had ensured they were trapped in a cage of burning stone. "Brynny." Fergus's voice was small, cracked with the sudden transition from sleep to nightmare. Oisín was already sitting up, his eyes wide and reflecting the flickering orange glow beginning to dance against the ceiling. "Stay back. Get under the bed." Brynn hissed, her voice a raw command. Panic was a rising tide, but she shoved it down with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on a decorative pike mounted above the hearth, a ceremonial relic of a war long forgotten. She ripped it from the wall, the weight of the iron nearly toppling her. She jammed the blunt end of the pike into the gap between the door and the frame, using her body as a lever. She threw every ounce of her strength against the pole. The wood groaned, but the bar held. She adjusted her grip, her palms sliding against the cold, etched iron. The friction was brutal. She felt the skin of her hands split, a hot, sticky slickness coating the metal, but she didn't let go. With a guttural cry that was more snarl than sob, she heaved one last time. The exterior bracket shattered with a spray of stone dust, and the door swung open so violently it nearly threw her into the hall. The corridor was already a throat of thick, acrid smoke. "Now," she gasped, grabbing a boy in each hand. She didn't lead them toward the main stairs where the iron-shod boots of mercenaries were already thundering. Instead, she backed into the shadows of the nursery's closet, pushing aside a heavy tapestry to reveal a narrow, soot-stained wooden panel. It was a passage built for the movement of laundry and secrets, a lightless vein that ran through the heart of the keep. As the first mercenary burst into the nursery behind them, his snarl vibrating through the floorboards, Brynn pulled the boys into the dark and slid the panel shut. The world of the castle was burning, but in the suffocating silence of the crawlspace, she could hear only three things: the roar of the fire, the boys' frantic breathing, and the steady, rhythmic drip of her own blood hitting the floorboards as she led them into the belly of the stone. The narrow veins of the servants' passage were choked with the smell of scorched stone and the frantic, shallow breaths of the terrified. Brynn moved through the dark by touch alone, her split palms stinging as she guided Fergus and Oisín down the steep, uneven stairs. Behind them, the castle groaned like a dying beast, but ahead, the silence of the secondary stairwell was suddenly shattered by a wet, guttural snarl. A shadow detached itself from the gloom at the base of the landing. He was a mercenary, half-shifted and massive, his jaw elongated into a snout that dripped with a hungry, predatory heat. His eyes were 2 points of obsidian reflecting the distant fire, and he focused on the boys with a low, vibrating growl that made the very air tremble. He didn't see an omega. He saw a meal and a paycheck. Brynn's heart hammered against her ribs, but the panic that had once paralyzed her was replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. She had no sword, no shield, and no wolf of her own to summon. All she had was the clay water jug she had snatched from the nursery washstand and a single, sputtering tallow candle gripped in her blood-slicked hand. As the wolfman lunged, his claws scraping the stone with a sound like grinding metal, Brynn didn't retreat. She shoved the boys into the recessed alcove behind her and stepped forward. She swung the heavy clay jug with every ounce of desperation in her frame, catching the mercenary squarely across his temple. The clay shattered in a spray of shards and cold water, the impact staggering the beast just long enough for Brynn to tip the guttering candle. The pool of molten, white-hot tallow spilled directly into the creature's open, half-shifted eyes. The scream that tore from his throat was inhuman. As he clawed frantically at his face, Blinded and shrieking, Brynn dropped the candle stub and threw her entire weight into his chest. She didn't just push. She launched herself with the ferocity of a creature protecting its den. The mercenary lost his footing on the slick stones, tumbling backward down the steep spiral of the stairs in a sickening cacophony of breaking bone and heavy thuds. The silence that followed was deafening. Brynn stood at the edge of the landing, her lungs burning as she gasped for air that tasted of smoke and tallow. Her legs felt like water, and a violent tremor took hold of her limbs, shaking her so hard she feared she might collapse. But even as the adrenaline ebbed, leaving her hollow and cold, she realized her fingers remained locked. She hadn't let go. She looked down to find Fergus and Oisín staring up at her, their small faces pale in the gloom, their hands anchored to hers as if she were the only solid thing left in a world turned to ash. Her hands were raw, her dress was torn, and the scent of the wolf she had just broken hung in the air, but Brynn straightened her spine. The tremor stayed, but her grip was iron. Without a word, she pulled the boys closer and moved back into the shadows, a ghost who had learned to bite back. The air at the exit of the crypt tunnels was a freezing shock, tasting of snow and the bitter, oily smoke of burning highlanders. Brynn stood in the mouth of the stone archway, her chest heaving, her fingers numbing as they dug into the boys' shoulders. Before them lay the great courtyard, a vast, open desert of frozen cobblestones illuminated by the orange glare of the burning keep. To reach the safety of the outer woods, they had to cross 100 yards of killing ground, fully exposed to the archers lining the battlements like vultures on a fence. High above, silhouetted against the roaring sky, stood Commander Callum Ashbourne. He didn't scream. He simply raised a hand and pointed. The metallic click of 40 crossbows engaging was a sound Brynn felt in her teeth. "Run," she whispered, her voice a ragged ghost of itself. "Don't look back. Just run for the trees." She unclasped her heavy, wool-lined servant's cloak, gripping the edges and spreading it wide behind the boys like the dark wings of a mother bird. They sprinted. The sound of their small boots on the stone was a frantic staccato in the silence. Brynn stayed a half-step behind, her body a living barrier between the Heirs and the wall. "Loose." Callum's voice dropped like an axe. The sky hissed. A black rain of iron-tipped bolts raked the courtyard. The first strike was a blunt, wet thud that nearly knocked the wind from her lungs. A bolt buried itself in her left shoulder, the force of it spinning her sideways, but she refused to fall. She gritted her teeth until they cracked, her vision blurring into a haze of red. A second later, a jagged heat tore through her side, hot and searing as a branding iron. She stumbled, a gasp of agony escaping her lips, but the sight of Oisín's small, terrified back kept her upright. 15 yards from the gate, Fergus tripped. He hit the stones hard, his small hands scraping the frost. Brynn didn't think. She moved with a predatory grace born of pure desperation. As the archers above reloaded, the air grew heavy with the lethal promise of the final volley.
Down.
"Stay down," she shrieked, throwing herself over the two boys. She pressed them into the frozen earth, locking her arms around their trembling frames and draping her blood-soaked cloak over their heads. She became a shell of meat and bone, a silent monument of defiance. The second volley fell. It wasn't a hiss, it was a rhythmic thumping of iron meeting flesh. One bolt pierced her back, then another, then a third. Each hit was a hammer blow, stealing her breath, draining the heat from her limbs until she felt only a strange, distant cold. She didn't move. She didn't scream. She simply tightened her hold on the children, her eyes fixed on the gray stones until the light began to fail. The world went silent. The roar of the fire seemed to retreat into the distance, leaving only the sound of the boy's muffled sobs beneath her chest. The darkness was closing in, heavy and absolute, when a new sound tore through the vacuum of the courtyard. It was low, enormous, and ancient, a war horn that sounded like the mountain itself was waking up. It was the voice of the north, vibrating through the cobblestones and into Brynn's very marrow. Cormac had come home. But as the darkness finally claimed her, Brynn's only thought was that the boys beneath her were still warm. The war horn's echo had not yet faded from the mountain peaks when the eastern breach was swallowed by a tidal wave of steel and fur. King Cormac Dreadhollow did not ride like a man. He rode like a catastrophe. He had covered 200 miles of Highland terrain in a fever of predatory instinct, driven by a psychic scream that had clawed at his insides until he nearly tore his own chest open. He breached the courtyard on a horse white with foam, his eyes fixed not on the burning armory or the fleeing traders, but on the silent, broken mound in the center of the killing ground. He vaulted from his mount before it had fully stopped, his boots hitting the blood-slicked cobblestones with a heavy, final thud. Around him, the battle for Dreadhollow was a cacophony of steel, but for Cormac, the world had gone deathly quiet. He reached the small figure in the torn servant's dress and froze. Brynn was pinned to the earth by iron, for crossbow bolts protruding from her back and shoulder like the jagged teeth of a trap. Her gray dress was soaked deep, horrific crimson, and her eyes were half-closed, fixed on nothing. "My sons," Cormac rasped, his voice a broken snarl. As he reached down to shift her weight, the mound stirred. From beneath the shelter of Brynn's cooling body, Fergus and Oisín emerged, pale, shaking, and utterly untouched by the iron that had shredded the girl above them. They clung to her even as Captain Donnac and the royal guards pulled them away, their small voices wailing her name. Cormac stared at the girl. He had walked past her 1,000 times in the corridors and never once looked her in the eye. He hadn't known her name. Yet here she lay, a nameless Omega who had stood where his own generals had fled. "She is fading, my king," Brother Seamus whispered, kneeling beside them. "Her heart has no rhythm left to give." Cormac didn't hesitate. He was a man of war, used to taking what he wanted by force, but as he looked at Brynn's waxen face, a primal, terrifying tether snapped tight in his gut. He bared his teeth and drew his dagger across his own wrist, the dark, potent alpha blood welling instantly. He pressed the wound to her lips, forcing the life force of the Dreadhollow line into her system. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. As the royal blood hit her veins, Brynn's back arched, her lungs gasping in a ragged, desperate breath. But it wasn't just healing. On the pale, blood-flecked skin of her throat, a searing heat began to radiate. A mark burned through the surface, a silver crescent moon entwined with a wild briar rose, glowing with a light so fierce it pierced the smoke of the courtyard. "The crest of Morrigan," Seamus gasped, falling to his knees. "The lost lineage of the High Queens." In that same heartbeat, a sound like a war drum detonated inside Cormac's chest. It was the mate bond, raw, savage, and absolute, slamming into his soul with the force of a landslide. Every instinct he possessed screamed in recognition. This was not a servant. This was not a ghost. This was his match, his mate, and the woman who had bled for everything he almost lost. He gathered her broken body into his arms, his forehead pressing against hers as he let out a low, possessive growl that shook the very foundations of the keep. The king had returned, but the world he knew was gone. In its place was a girl with a silver mark and a soul that belonged to him. The solar was a cage of cold moonlight and lengthening shadows, smelling of lavender and the metallic tang of Brynn's own drying blood. Outside, the Highland breach was a roar of distant thunder and war horns as Cormac's vanguard clashed with the remnants of the betrayal, but inside the tower, the air had gone unnaturally still. Brynn stood before the arched window, her body aching with the phantom weight of the bolts that had recently pierced her. The alpha's blood still hummed to her veins, a golden heat that made her skin prickle and her heart beat with a rhythm that wasn't entirely her own. Beside her, Fergus and Oisín huddled in the recessed stone of the hearth, their eyes wide as they watched the window. They didn't see the army in the valley. They saw the shadows scaling the sheer cliff face of the tower. 6 figures, draped in the ashen gray of the Greycloak assassins, vaulted over the sill with the fluid, silent grace of smoke. They were Brennan, the Unmaid's personal shadow guard, wolves who had traded their humanity for the cold efficiency of the kill. Donnac Ironskin lay unconscious by the door, and the royal guards had been lured to the lower gates. Brynn reached for the silver-hilted dagger Cormac had left her, her fingers curling around the cold metal. The lead assassin, a massive she-wolf with eyes like clouded glass and a jagged scar across her throat, let out a low, clicking laugh. She didn't fear a servant girl, even one bearing a king's mark. She saw only a target and two small prizes. As the grey cloaks fanned out, their blades catching the moonlight, Brynn felt a sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. The dagger in her hand felt heavy, clumsy, an insult to the power beginning to coil in the base of her spine. The Morrigan blood, awakened by the king's sacrifice and the proximity of her enemies, began to sing. It wasn't a song of submission, it was a hymn of ancient, territorial command. Brynn opened her hand. The dagger clattered to the stone floor, the sound echoing like a bell. She stepped forward, shielding the boys not with her back this time, but with her presence. She lifted her hands, palms outward, and as she did, the silver mark on her throat blazed with a light so blinding it turned the shadows to ash. Her eyes, once a quiet, overlooked brown, ignited into twin pools of molten Highland silver. The lead assassin lunged, her blade aimed at Brynn's heart, but the air around Brynn thickened into an impenetrable wall of sheer will. Brynn didn't scream.
She didn't plead.
She drew a breath that seemed to pull the very air from the room, and when she spoke, the voice didn't come from her lungs. It vibrated up through the granite foundations, through the roots of the mountain, and into the marrow of every living thing in the tower. Kneel. The word was a physical weight, a tectonic shift that brooked no defiance. The grey cloaks didn't choose to stop. Their bodies simply betrayed them. The lead she-wolf's knees hit the flagstones with a sickening crack, her forehead slammed into the floor, and her blade skittered away. Behind her, the other 5 assassins collapsed as if their spines had turned to water, pinned to the stone by a gravity they could not fight. They lay prostrate, gasping and broken, stripped of their killing frenzy by a girl who had spent her life being walked over. Brynn stood over them, the silver fire in her eyes unblinking, the true Luna of the North finally awake. The great hall of Dreadhollow Keep was no longer a cavern of cold stone and whispered betrayals. Today, it was flooded with the amber glow of 1,000 heather torches and the sweet, wild scent of mountain gorse. The heavy oak rafters, which had so recently echoed with the shrieks of the dying, now hummed with the expectant silence of a kingdom reborn. The blood had been scrubbed from the masonry, and the traitors had met their end at the edge of the Highland cliffs. Callum Ashbourne's hollow honor finally stripped away, and Lady Morag Sinclair's cold ambition buried in the silent earth. At the base of the long stone aisle, Brynn Morrigan stood alone. She no longer wore the threadbare gray of a ghost. Her gown was the deep, midnight green of the Highland pines, stitched with silver thread that mirrored the mark upon her throat. As she took her first step, the sound of her soft leather slippers on the flagstones was a rhythmic reminder of her journey. She had scrubbed these very stones on bleeding knees. She had carried the buckets of ash and the burdens of 1,000 invisible days along this path. Now, the most powerful alphas in the north, men who had once looked through her as if she were made of mist, dropped to one knee as she passed. They did not bow for her bloodline alone. They bowed for the girl who had stood when they ran. Fergus walked on her left, his small chin tilted high with a pride that finally matched his father's. Oisín walked on her right, his small hand anchored firmly to the silk of her gown, his gentle eyes bright with a joy that needed no soap carvings to express. They were the heartbeat at her side, the living proof of the choice she had made in the smoke and fire. At the dais, King Cormac waited. He had traded his war-torn armor for the heavy velvet of his station, but his eyes were fixed solely on Brynn with a hunger that was raw and absolute. The mate bond between them was no longer a frantic drumbeat of survival. It was a steady, grounding heat that filled the hall. As she reached him, Cormac did not wait for her to kneel. He stepped down from the iron throne, meeting her on the level stone, and took her scarred hands in his. To the one who stayed, he said, his voice a low thunder that carried to the furthest corners of the rafters. To the shield of my blood and the soul of this kingdom. Brother Seamus stepped forward, bearing a cushion of tattered silk. Upon it sat the ancient crown of the Morrigan, a delicate, fierce circle of silver briar roses and moonstone that had been missing for 20 winters. Cormac took the silver in his hands and placed it upon Brynn's head with a reverence that made the air tremble. The silence held for a heartbeat, and then it broke. It was not the jagged howl of a hunt or the scream of a siege. It was a deep, melodic roar that started in the throats of the guards and spread to the very edges of the citadel. It was the sound of a pack that had finally found its heart. The Omega girl who was dust had become the queen who was stone. As the roar of 1,000 wolves shook the mountain, Brynn looked into the eyes of her king and knew that she was no longer invisible. She was home.